He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 26 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back with another episode, Henry, and today we're joined by an old friend, Sean Duffy, CEO of the Duffy Agency in Boston and Malmo, Sweden. So we're going to be talking about international brand building. Sean has a brand new book out, and he'll tell us all about it. Let's take a watch and listen. Henry, we're back with another episode of the Brief Brothers, and I'm delighted to say that we're joined today by, I guess I can say, an old friend, even though this is the first time I've actually looked him in the eye because of Zoom. This is Sean Duffy, who is the CEO of Duffy. Is it Duffy Advertising or Duffy Consulting?
Duffy Agency.
Duffy Agency. Now, Duffy Agency is multiple homes. He's in Boston as well as Malmo, Sweden. Did I mutilate the word of the city?
No, that is correct.
Okay. So right off the bat, we have this sense that Sean is an internationalist, and that's really a cool part of his background. I got to know Sean, I guess I reached out to him in 2010 after my first book, How to Write an Inspired Creative Brief, was out for about a year. He'd written an article, a regular column that he was doing, and it was something about the article that caught my attention and my imagination. I reached out to him. I think I sent you a copy of the book, and that kind of got our friendship started. And he's been a supporter and an advocate and a friend ever since. So it's a real delight to have you on the show with us today. Welcome, Sean Duffy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially, as you said, after over a decade of constant correspondence, to finally be talking to each other.
Yes. So Sean, why don't you just, as a little bit of background before we jump in and ask you some questions about your agency and your work and your new book, tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm curious, what is your connection to Sweden and to Europe? Have you always been fascinated by international events? Do you love to travel? How did you get this whole thing started? How did you start the agency? Give us a little bit of background about who you are and what you're doing.
All of the above, yes. I like to travel. I mean, I started out out of college as a editorial cartoonist, and soon realized that, it was kind of lonely sitting in your apartment every day drawing cartoons for 8 hours. So well, what else can I do? And put a book together. There's a book by Ken Haas back then, How to Get a Job in Advertising. Read it. Went out and was hired as a copywriter for BBDO, and that was in Boston when BBDO had an office in Boston. I had never studied advertising, so I approached it like school. I brought a notebook to work every day. I'd talk to interview people all I could, and very academic about the whole thing. But yeah, and then worked at BBDO, decided I wanted to do the backpacking thing in Europe because I did like to travel. Backpack, wound up in London, wanted to live there. I had my book sent over, and as a copywriter, you needed your book back then, and it got lost. And I was like, yeah, and there wasn't digital copies back then, and I was heartbroken. And I started from scratch, putting together a scratchbook in London, sitting there, running out of money at that point too, and wondering what I was going to do. And I got hired by an agency in London. I thought, great, I'm going to live in Europe now. And they immediately shipped me off to San Francisco to be creative director of an agency in San Francisco, which I didn't want to do until I got there. After about a couple of months, I realized that I loved San Francisco. Stayed there for 5 years, met a girl from Sweden. And one morning—
That's usually how it happens.
Yeah, exactly. We woke up and she said, I have to go back to Sweden. I'm like, God, why didn't you tell me that before we started dating? It'd be easier that way. So our plan was we'd go back to Sweden for 3 years. We went back in 1991. I moved back to Sweden and moved back to the US a couple of years ago, so 27, 28 years, my 3-year overseas stint. Anyhow, I got over there. I worked as creative director for the Low Group in Stockholm, now Low Mullen, I guess. Worked there as creative director for 10 years, but only on international because my Swedish wasn't that good, so they couldn't use me on anything domestic. I was useless, so I was like highly motivated. I started with the SAS account. It was the only Swedish Scandinavian Airlines. It's the only account I could work on because it was the only thing that needed English. And I was highly motivated to get some more international work into the agency just for job security, and did that. We grew the international department. We grew substantially over those 10 years. 2001, decided to, like a lot of people, I think I can do this on my own, and left and started my own agency. And that's where we are today. So.
And the rest is history. Okay.
Yeah, and we still have the office. I mean, I'm more time in the States now, especially since COVID. I've been kind of grounded a little bit. Yeah. But still work out of Sweden and the U.S.
Well, I want to address the book. I want to give you a chance to really, talk about your book. But before we do that, I was really impressed when I was reading some of the comments that your clients, past and current, have made about you on your LinkedIn page. And I read a couple of pages of the opening of your book. And on the landing page of my website, I have a claim. I have a headline that says the best kept secret for transforming your brand, which is essentially my argument about what the creative brief is or can be. It's transformative. As I was reading the comments of your clients, current and past, that was the thought I had about the Duffy Agency. That because I've known about you for the last 10 years. And I don't know if Henry has heard about the Duffy Agency. I'm going to just say, you know what? I don't know everything about everything in the ad business, but you sound like a best kept secret for what you bring to the party in advertising, especially international branding. And I'm wondering if you sense that too. It's like your clients rave about you. Let me just read one that I read. It's from Edward Zhang, founder of Zen EST Public Relations. He says this book, and he's referring to your book, but I think he's also talking about your thinking and what you bring to the party, for your agency. He says this book is very practical with useful methodologies and concrete case studies. I'm eager to see the Chinese edition quickly, so it will be a timely gift for those Chinese companies and marketers who are planning to run or are already operating businesses abroad. Marketers can take this book as a marketing Bible for international market entry and operations. Are you the best kept secret for international branding that we're just starting to learn about?
I don't know. I mean, I didn't choose it. When I got to Sweden in 2001, the idea of right now there's a whole industry really around what they call localization in advertising, which is slightly different than what we call in the States cross-cultural advertising, talking to different groups within the U.S. It really didn't exist as a discipline back then. It was just I was thrown into it, and I had, I wanted to work, and it was great. I loved my agency that I was working with there. So we just kind of honed that specialty, and I wouldn't say that, there's not like a special discipline of international advertising. It wasn't an area where people could say, we really need an international group. So in that case, maybe, there wasn't a category for me, really. I mean, for the agency in that sense, to kind of occupy or dominate. The other thing is also aspirations. I mean, we've always been a mid-sized agency. For most of the time as an agency, we were about 25, 30 people. And I was really happy with that. I, walked 4 blocks to get to work. The lifestyle was super important. I was busy, happy, profitable. Growing beyond that wasn't really on the top of my list of things to do. I mean, and it's been that way now since 2001. So, so I guess, I never became, and when you meet people, like I remember we had a cooperation with Shy Day at one point way back when, and you see those kind of companies like Jay Shy built, and it's another level for me in terms of business, not necessarily in terms of the work, but that was that's a real accomplishment.
I've always worked in agencies that were between 30 and 100 employees, and I can't imagine how you scale something like an ad agency, like really scale an ad agency. Yeah. I mean, we see acquisitions and mergers, but something has to get lost. I just can't imagine that you can scale an ad agency and that the culture is going to be the same at 5,000 people as it is at 50 people.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I noticed, when I started, the academic approach to this, I was reading all the books by Ogilvy and Caples and everything else, and really getting into, and there was an idea back then that a copywriter was the person who really digs in deep and gets to understand the product in a way that no one ever dreamed of, the details, and understands the buyers in the same way. And from that, we find that nugget that we can spin into truth. And I guess today, a lot of that is a planner's job, maybe some of it. But I just noticed the larger agencies I got in, the less time there was to do that.
Yeah, we just had George Tannenbaum as a guest, and he's a copywriter, and he's kind of that old school copywriter. We had a long conversation about that exact topic, about he's a guy who likes to get into the nuts and bolts of the client's business, wants to know how everything works, wants to know, because he believes that within all of that, he's going to find the one interesting thing that he can bring out in an ad that will make it interesting and make you pay attention. So that's really interesting. But I think you're right. I think probably the reason that my role even exists is partially because of that scaling up of these ad agencies. There's just no way that you can have creatives doing that kind of work on so many accounts, and you know what I mean, like getting deep into the nitty gritty with the clients. So
yeah, absolutely.
And that's something I think is to the detriment of our profession. I mean, when you think about guys like what the agency worlds were like back in the 50s and 60s with the Ogilvy's and the Birnbachs, and when he established the creative teams, that kind of attitude, that let's find that nugget that George was talking about. And we had Cameron Day on a couple of weeks ago, the son of Guy Day.
Yeah.
Guy Day. He wrote a chapter in his book that talked about the Capodastro bar, which was in my first edition. I love that story about the copywriter who goes to the factory of the piano manufacturer whose account they just won, and discovers this thing called the Capodastro bar, which is a hidden piece of wood in the piano that prevents the thing from warping and losing its sound quality. But if he hadn't gone on
50 years, like it doesn't. The thing about the story, and I love the story too. I've heard Howard say it a few times. The thing about the story is that the Capodastro bar doesn't even do anything for like the first 50 years of the life of the piano. It takes over to preserve the sound of the piano after the first 50 years.
But that's something that no one will ever forget. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean,
and the copywriter had the tenacity to go dig and find out, because he wasn't happy with whatever else that the marketers and the product folks were telling him. So it's that intrepidity. Is that how you say it? Intrepidity.
Yeah.
Intrepidness, I think.
That we as creatives, and Henry too, as a researcher in his role as a planner, need to bring to this thing we call advertising. And your point that when you scale too big, the time doesn't exist to do that, which is kind of a sad testimony.
Yeah, the timing, part of it's probably due to scaling. And when a company gets to a certain size, there are certain earning expectations and pressure on people that in a mid-sized agency you didn't always have. It was more, your name's on the door and you want to get it right. Period. That tends to get a little bit diluted, I think. And also there is this sensation. I address it at the end of the book. There's a strategist at Harvard, I think she's at Harvard, who basically said that it's impossible today to have a sustainable competitive advantage. So just give it up. You can only get an advantage for like a couple of months, and then you got to reinvent yourself, and all that stuff sounds really nice. And her motivation is that things change so quick now. And I'm just thinking, like, you mean for the rest of history before right now, things just didn't change? Everything was static, and we could have had a competitive advantage and developed one for brands with strategy, but now we can't. It just didn't ring true. I mean, arguably the change from not having electricity to having electricity was probably a bigger change than not having an iPhone and having an iPhone now. So
don't tell that to kids these days, though.
But I just think it's more that this. It's more about that we feel rushed. And when you feel rushed, there is no time for strategies, no time for briefs. There's no time for brand strategy. There's no time for, it's just do and count the clicks. And I think that is the feeling that there's no time for discipline, for the discipline of strategy and planning is the bigger problem than we live in a time where everything's happening so fast we can't do planning or strategy. So
well, you kind of skirted around the topic that we've talked about a lot, and that's the debate between true differentiation and distinctiveness, as Byron Sharp, puts forth. And I'm a big believer in what Byron Sharp says, because the truth is, the difference in capability between my Android phone and the latest iPhone isn't that much, but how you build up a brand and how you make it sound different and present itself differently to an audience so that they recognize that it's you right away, and so that they can either be attracted to it or not, because let's face it, some brands are polarizing, and I think that's something that clients are afraid to be. But if you can get the 50% of the market in anything, right, it's okay if you don't get the other 50%.
Absolutely.
So being polarizing isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, although some clients are deathly afraid of it. But I do tend to believe that, in terms of products and services, true differentiation over time becomes less sustainable. I think what you need to do is build up that distinctiveness, and that's kind of like the protective shell around your brand that keeps people loyal or not loyal, and because Byron Sharp would disapprove of that, but definitely top of mind, right? And easy to have mental availability for that brand because it's so distinctive. What do you think about that take?
Well, I actually just finished a course with Mark Ritson on brand strategy. I don't know if you guys have heard. It's from Marketing Week.
Yes, I did both the mini MBA and in marketing and the one in brand management.
I now feel grotesquely undereducated. Just
I'm a disciple of Ritson's, and have been for a long time. I was actually in the first cohort that took the mini MBA in marketing, and then I was in the first cohort for the brand management, but I ended up stopping in the middle of the course because my wife had a brain aneurysm and I couldn't keep up with the coursework. And Mark was lovely, and he said, "Look, just re-enroll. You're already paid for, no worries." And so I graduated in the second cohort.
That's fantastic. And your wife's okay?
Oh yeah, she's fine.
Fantastic.
They caught it before it ruptured, and she had a surgery, and everything turned out okay. But yeah, it was a tough go. I was working full time at the agency. I was teaching a class at the University of Miami, and I was taking this mini MBA in brand management.
I'd put it off for the same reason. I said, I don't want to start this thing and not finish it. And it got to be a challenge after a while. I did okay for that. It was just like, it's actually not so different from being in college. It started out okay at the beginning of the semester. I was keeping up. And then near the end, I was putting it off because I had other stuff to do. And I was cramming near the end. But did
you do the brand management or the marketing?
I did the marketing. I'm thinking of doing the brand management if I have time this spring. I think it starts up in April.
So we were talking about Byron Sharp, and you were going to give your.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, but he made a point, and he said, we can talk strategy all we want, and memorability. He goes, do you realize that most of it, and everything he says is backed up by tons of research. He said most of it just is the brand gets in front of your face and says, "Hey, remember me? I'm here." He goes, that in itself, if you can just manage to do that, you have a huge advantage. The problem today is there's so much media and we're inundated that either you won't get in front of their face because there's so many other things in front of the buyer's face, or two, you just won't get seen because in the noise of all the other people, you'll get lost.
But I think that's the case for distinctiveness. I mean, when you do all of the research and you do the focus groups and you do the quant and you arrive at the same conclusion that everybody else arrived at, and you give that straightforward, rational message, you're going to sound like everybody else. When you do the quirky thing, when you have the weird color, the interesting logo, the weird sense of humor, that gets you noticed. And it's kind of like a, hey, look at me. And then once they know who you are and what you stand for, then it becomes like the practice of what Paul Feldwick calls keeping your brand before the public.
Yeah.
Right. Keeping your name before the public.
I mean, but that is the skill. I mean, the easy way, I think, is, for a creative team, it's easy to shock people. It's really not that hard. We know what buttons we can push depending on what culture we're in, and you can do it. But, I remember I used to use it as an example for my creative teams. There was a bunch of some sunglasses were launched, and they created the people's faces were basically butts, and they, if you can imagine, photoshopping a butt onto someone's neck and then putting sunglasses on it. It was grotesque. It was grotesque. It didn't look cool or sexy or anything. It just looked grotesque. Anyhow, that it got a lot. I mean, it was written up actually because it was so weird. But do you really want to be seen wearing those sunglasses? So they didn't really think 4 steps ahead to brand affinity. Yeah, you got my attention. You got in front of me. Good job for that. But the art is actually to be able to do that in a way that's relevant and that doesn't start to close doors, further down the sales cycle.
Yeah, I had a creative director who was the only creative director I actually quote. And the one that Henry have heard me quote before is he said, draw the circle, but don't complete it. But the other thing he said, which is relevant to what you're just pointing out, and this is nothing unique to my creative director, but he said, all advertising must do these 2 things and in this order, be invasive and persuasive. Absolutely. So your sunglass wearing butts were invasive.
Yes.
But were they persuasive?
Exactly.
And the other part of that calculation is long term. Like, is that a sustainable? You might get some shock value, like you said, out of the one execution, but really, what's beneath it? Is this a brand that shocks people? And then you could find different ways to shock people. And there's some brands that do that, right? They do it and they do it well, and that becomes their personality. But I think that's the difference between a one-off, like a shock value one-off, and creating a brand that's distinctive, quirky, maybe shocking, maybe what. By the way, it doesn't have to be. It could be emotionally touching. It could be whatever it is, as long as it's different from everything else that's in the category and in the marketplace, that makes you stand, and that's congruent with the brand, right? Like, because that's the other thing, is if it's not congruent with the brand, then what the hell are you doing?
Yeah. I mean, I used to work with Diesel jeans a long time ago, and they were brave because they said, look, we know, a large portion of the people we're talking to are going to be totally turned off by what we're about to do. And that's good, because the ones who aren't, we're going to own them, because they're going to be so loyal to us. And they did. I mean, every ad had blatant shock value in it. In some way,
that was what their brand was about exactly. Shocking people. Like it's one thing for a brand to be like cruising along at a certain altitude and then do something shocking and then go back to. That's not going to, unless you're repositioning a brand and say, you know what, from now on we have to do X, Y, and Z to get people's attention, and clearly define it and then continue to deliver on that.
Yeah, I mean, this was part of a strategy. It wasn't the creative, because the creative team, to their own devices, will often, if not constrained by a brief in some way, often go into that territory. It's good for their career. It's good for, getting a pencil. It's good for a lot of things. Not necessarily good for the client, though.
Yeah. And interesting that you say that. There's a podcast out called Tagline, which is put together by Clio. It's called Muse by Clio, and they did a whole backstory on the Volkswagen Super Bowl ad called "The Force" with that little kid dressed up as Darth Vader. Uh-huh. And one of the creatives was interviewed for this story, like how it all came about, and he said, "Well, we had what you would call the best and the worst brief you could ever imagine, because the client basically said, do anything you want.
Oh boy,
just make it big." And the creative was aware enough. This guy sounded pretty smart. He said, to some people that would sound like an awesome brief, but then there's no boundaries.
Absolutely.
And Henry and I talk about this a lot. A creative brief is designed to be a box that you should stay within and resist. And your imagination resists the box, and that's where the ideas come from. So here's an example of well, it turned out to be a brilliant ad. It's a great story to listen to if you ever want to hear the backstory. But they had no boundaries.
Yeah, you end up playing a game of pin the tail on the donkey, right? You're blindfolded and you're just going up there trying to, put it on somewhere. And they got lucky. They
did. It was a freelancer. It happened to be a freelancer who was just called in to help pitch for Super Bowl ideas, and he was involved in it for, well, not just a few hours. Let's just say less than a week of concepting with a. He was an art director, not even a writer. Anyway.
But I always used to think, if you said to me, look, here's $1 million, go out and entertain someone for 30 seconds, and you're a half decent writer or art director, and you've got a good team with you, it's not really, if you think about it, if you're trained writer, it's not that hard a thing. And I think Super Bowl ads, I love them, but that's not advertising, that's sponsored entertainment. And it's like the halftime show or the quarter time show or whatever. It's a showcase for sponsored entertainment that might somehow relate back to the brand.
And junior teams are not likely to get that assignment. So the senior creatives, who are often going to be the ones who say, you know what, I don't need, just give me your brief, whatever it is, I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to rewrite it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly.
Because it's got to be top level entertainment. I mean, because none of the reviews after the Super Bowl ads are about how persuasive it was. Everyone, and we want it.
I think the Holy Grail is when you have that spot that gets attention, gets noticed, and really does something for the brand. And specifically, I have one of the fondest memories that I have of Super Bowl ads. I worked at Hill Holiday, a Boston-based agency I worked for them from 2003 to 2007. And so I wasn't there when they did this Super Bowl ad for Anheuser-Busch, but it was on the reel because it was recent. And so we were very all familiar. Everybody that worked there was familiar with it. And it was the one with the Clydesdales. This was 2002, January 2000, February 2002, right after 9/11 in 2001. And that's the one where the Clydesdales are coming down and everybody's really somber, and then there's a point where the Clydesdales stop and they all bow to where the Twin Towers were. Yeah. And I mean, that's that convergence of things that you can't control, like the moment that the country was going through an all-American brand, a really well put together creative execution, the production values were amazing, so there is an opportunity. I think that to me is like the Holy Grail of hitting it out of the park with a Super Bowl. I think that Darth Vader ad caught a lot of people's attention too. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So Sean, let's turn our attention to your wonderful book. It's called International Brand Strategy: A Guide to Achieving Global Brand Growth. Now, one of the things I was thinking about as I was starting to read some of the reviews of the book and the opening chapter was that brands have trouble breaking through no matter where they are. If it's a local brand, a national brand, so many products are introduced and fail miserably. You were debating about, is it a 95% failure rate with a new product, or is it 50%? And even if it's only 50%, that's, it's 1 out of 2 are gonna die. Exactly. So now we're talking about taking a brand that exists in one country and trying to introduce it into another country. Are the challenges multiplied, or if you truly understand your brand, does that help you at least get things off the ground? Give us a little sense in a summary of the point that you're trying to make in your book and how the challenges of building a brand in one country translate when you try to do it internationally.
I think the first thing that comes about is typically if a brand does well in one country, typically the United States, we've had dozens and dozens of these cases. They just think, well, we've done it. We've figured out how to crack the code in the market. So go do that in Europe. or go do that, or and that in itself, go do that in Europe. We were working for a major consumer product over here that did really well in the States. And so we got a call and they said, hey, could you help us, launch it in Europe? I said, okay, what countries in Europe? There's no such thing. There's no market as Europe. It's like, and that just was like, what do you mean? It's Europe, as if it was like the United States of Europe and all the countries were just states, really. I mean, there's dozens of languages, dozens of cultures, and we ended up, we just stopped and we said, well, we can't do it. There's no market for your product. It was a diet product, put it that way, which had a lot to do with targeting. Their target market were women, and it was a lot to do with body image and eating habits. Now, if you live in Sweden, as I was at the time, you know that the eating habits in Sweden and the idea of body image is fundamentally different from just 90 miles away down in Berlin, or a couple hundred miles more, you're down in Italy. You can't just launch a product like that. So a lot of it has to really overcoming that temptation just to take the strategy that worked in the States and just redo it. That's I think a lot of it. And I open with the story of Target. Now, Target, the retail store, their headquarters is in Minneapolis. It's like a couple of hundred miles from Canada. And they thought they could just waltz into Canada like they do right now. I have a hard time imagining that Target could open a store in America and it would not be a success. I mean, they're so smart about how they do everything. But all they had to do was go a couple of hundred miles north. And, they were bankrupt within about a year, lost billions of dollars, and had to leave Canada, never to return, or at least not yet. How does that happen? And that really was one of the impetuses to write the book was how do such successful brands and smart marketers make such rookie mistakes the minute they leave their home country? Why does that happen? And so the book explores that and tries to show ways in which you can avoid that from happening. So.
And what's your sense of the reception? I mean, I read nothing but great reviews of the book. What have you been hearing from colleagues, from people in the industry, from, I hope, future clients?
The reception has been exceptional. So this morning, I got a text from Scotland, and it's someone I know. He owns an agency over there. He says, okay, I've read your book. And he goes, don't take this the wrong way. And I'm just ready. He's just going to lay into the book. And he goes, I actually was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. And then he went on, I said, I hate business books. I certainly hate business books about marketing strategy. And I loved your book because it was so easy to read. And he goes, yeah, good job. So that was always nice. Nice to hear.
When I was talking to Howard about this episode, I thought it would be great to have you on because in some ways, I think that idea of, presenting a brand to a different culture is what I do every day, what I've been doing for 25 years with the U.S. Hispanic market. Now, there's overlap and there's mutual influence, right? Like Hispanics are influenced by the culture at large, and they're also influencing the culture at large.
Yes.
But I think the smart marketers understand that there are, all kinds of like cultural undertones to the way people find out about products, the products that they trust, how they use products, particularly, in the packaged goods space, in the household cleaning and things like that you would think like, oh, that's all universal, and it's not. Like,
Absolutely.
When you have a low household income as a Hispanic, I actually have an anecdote. I did some focus groups for a company that has edited assortment grocery stores, right? They basically go into, at that time, they were mainly African-American neighborhoods, but they were like small footprint. And instead of like 100,000 SKUs, which is what a typical grocery store has, they had like 20,000. So it's like about a fifth of the size of a regular grocery store. And most of the stuff was their store brand, right? So it was generic stuff, super cheap. And so we were doing focus. They wanted to explore the Hispanic market. and we wanted it, so they wanted to find people with household incomes less than $15,000. We're talking, this was like 2000, 1999, 2000, around there. So 15,000, you can imagine today it'd be like 25,000, 30,000 household income. And we recruited these women, and they all came dressed up with makeup on, jewelry on. And the guy said, I can't believe these women are less than. And I said, the thing you don't understand is that culturally, no Hispanic woman, particularly an immigrant generation woman, is going to go in public to a place to give her opinions and talk to strangers dressed in anything less than her Sunday best. Like, that's part of the culture, is like, what are they going to think about me? I don't want them to think less of me. And exactly. And I think that's we deal with that on the Hispanic market a lot, in terms of like learning the culture is a big part for our clients.
Absolutely. I mean, our first rule of thumb when we go into a new market is get on an airplane, because I had been doing a bunch of work in Africa, and I had just finished up like 3 months of like constant travel, spending a lot of time down there. And I got a call from a client. He said, hey, why don't you work on this? But, I want you to go down and spend, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks in Harare. And I was like, okay. But I said, I think I've been spending so much time there now, and in a related field, this was for a healthcare product, that I think I can do it. And he goes, now I really want you to go. And I'm the guy who used to pressure him. He was the CEO at a previous company I worked with. Anyhow, on the plane on the way down, I'm thinking, I bet you I can kind of sketch out the strategy right now, at least the bones of it. So I get down there and I'll just fill it in with, interviews and whatever. It took me like 3 days there, and I realized everything I thought was completely wrong. This was Zimbabwe. It wasn't Kenya. And this was, I was wrong, completely wrong.
It sounds to me like you could have given some great advice to the State Department on a lot of foreign affairs issues about,
Actually, in this particular case, we were meeting with, all the ministers, and it was, I can't tell you how tense it was, because if they say the wrong thing at that time, this is when Mugabe was still in charge, they would be killed. And there were some extremely interesting moments. That's one thing I love about my job. If you like to travel and really understand, get into cultures, it's been a fantastic experience in that way.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I want to go back to that anecdote you were telling us earlier about I guess it was it a diet? Was it a diet product or some other product where they called you and they said, we want you to help us launch the product in Europe?
Yes.
And then you said, okay, where in Europe?
Yeah.
And they said, well, Europe.
Exactly.
How often do you encounter that kind of thinking?
A lot.
Or lack of it?
Well, not to point any fingers, but it's mostly from the U.S. When European clients never ask that. They're very specific about. They never say we want to launch in Asia. I mean, it'll be a province in China, and even then, it'll be But in the States, it's not uncommon for us to get calls to say, yeah, we want to launch in Europe, and after that, Asia. And it's like, okay, well, slow down. There are differences that you might not be recognizing in these countries. I'd get it the other way too. When you're overseas, people love to point out to you, wow, that there's a big difference in the United States too, between Boston and Los Angeles, for instance. That's true, but there are a lot of commonalities. It isn't quite the same thing as a completely different culture with a different language. And even when we talk about, okay, we try when we do strategies to do a global value proposition. So we want the value proposition to travel. The positioning, though, we don't care. I mean, positioning is, by its definition, in relation to what? The competitors. And those will be different in every market, including, almost always some sort of something outside the category, like a home
substitute products. I was about, yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of stuff, it really, there's not a lot to get it. you really can't get away from the fact that you really need to approach the market with a fresh mind and look at it really with your eyes open. Because if you don't, you won't see anything.
Well, let me ask you, Henry and I, we talk about creative briefs. We're called the Brief Brothers. So I want to, at some point, we always like to bring things back to the brief, although we love to just let the conversation go where it will take us. But because you and I got to know each other long time ago because of the brief, let me just ask you, what challenges, what interesting insights do you bring to writing a brief? Not just you writing it, but your team writing a brief and your creatives responding to and reacting to and working from briefs, given the international situation. Is there something different, something unique that you like to bring to that process? Yeah,
it's a little more challenging because unless we're using a creative team in the culture, and oftentimes we're not, you have to, in the brief, not only convey the nugget of the idea and get them inspired, you also have to help them understand what it's like. And again, the best way to do it is to put the creative team on an airplane and send them down to the place where they need to, the culture that they need to do it for. That's helpful. Not always possible though. But that's I would say the extra burden. I mean, right now we still write a lot of briefs, but we're doing more, our focus is now more on marketing strategy and brand strategy on an international basis. And I almost look at it like, when we approach a new client, I've got like an ocean of possibilities in front of me. I mean, we could do anything with this. It could be like this or that. And as a strategist, I like to get under the water, study it, and reduce that down to like a pool of possibilities that I can then pass on to the brief writing process, to the planner. And they take that pool of possibilities and reduce it down to a bucket of possibilities. And then when I was creative director, I would always come between the brief and before it was briefed and work with the planner to get it down to basically a cup of possibilities. Mm-hmm. And then we give that to the creative team and they come up with a drop. and it's almost like reduction in cooking. You start out with a big thing of chicken broth, or maple syrup's a great example. They're just starting to do that around here. You start off with something that's big, and through the process of reducing it in a purposeful manner, you wind up with something that is, in its essence, extremely powerful. And so that's so it's the same process when we're doing this internationally, and even when we're doing our strategies. We need to turn these marketing and brand strategies into creative briefs to get something done. And with that is the added, I would say, chore of including culture in that.
So. Yeah, well, I mean, Henry, we've talked about this before. We've done a couple episodes on what Henry does through his, Hispanic marketing. And he's talked about some of the creatives on his staff who are not, I don't think they're not fully bilingual. I don't want to say they don't speak English at all, but they're not fully bilingual. And that can be an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage. In fact, Henry, I'm stepping in your territory, but it was really interesting in that conversation we had about how you deal with creatives who are not as bilingual as some of the others. Yeah, and compared to the challenge that Sean is talking about.
In a lot of cases, you end up filling gaps where creatives have gaps. So another interesting phenomenon, it's peculiar to what I do in Hispanic, is a lot of our creatives that come from Latin America, right? They're not typical of the audience that we're advertising to here in the United States, right? Like they're college educated, they're upper middle class in Latin America. A lot of them come from the big cities like Mexico City or Buenos Aires or Bogota. And a lot of the Hispanics that come to the United States come from rural areas. They settle in big cities in the US, but they come from rural areas in the home country in Mexico or Argentina or wherever it is. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect between what they've seen as general market advertising in their home country and what US Hispanic advertising is, because the target audience is completely different. So I think as a strategist, part of my role is like to fill in those gaps. And with language, as Howard was saying, like sometimes, selling a concept, we could write the best Spanish copy in the world, but we have to present it to the client in English. Exactly. And so that English translation has to have the same creative zing to it that it can't just be like, oh, well, it sounds better in Spanish, because they're not going to buy it. They're not going to fall in love with it.
Absolutely.
So in some cases, I end up being like not a translator, but like an adapter of copy. Like say like, hey, this turn of the phrase doesn't exist in English, but we have one that's similar that we can, so there's a lot of that goes on.
Absolutely.
Sean, have you had a personal experience with writing a line or having one of your creatives write a line that ends up being like nothing sucks like an Electrolux?
No, thankfully not. I actually go through in the book. I start out with that saying, those are the mistakes that, they get a lot of publicity. They're really funny.
Right.
But they're not the kind of things that actually hurt brands. Really, brands get those kind of things. You never hear about them because the brand just kind of slowly dies away. And but if you think about all those things, none of them ever had a, you've got the example of the mist stick by Revlon. It was a curling iron. Mist in German means manure, so the manure stick, no one wanted to buy that. The urban legend about the Chevy Nova, Nova. So
yeah. That's a big one. There was one. This was a real one. I don't remember the airline, but there was an airline that was their business class, and they had these leather seats, and the headline was "Vuela en cuero," which means fly on leather. But in Spanish, the word en cuero, all one word, is fly nude or fly naked. Yeah,
exactly. Fly naked.
But I think that was done tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
And it got the desired effect.
Exactly.
Like sometimes I think, you read about and you hear about and I lived through it, the New Coke fiasco, right? New Coke, in essence, was the best marketing campaign that ever existed for old Coke. Whether that was the intent or not, people really realized that they had an emotional attachment to this product, and it was a sort of what do they call it when you withhold something from somebody? Burger King did it with a Whopper and the Whopper freak out. Like you withhold something that people want, and then they
want it all the more.
Yeah, they freak out.
Yeah, I don't know if that. I mean, the weird thing about marketing, of all the different business disciplines, I've never been involved in a marketing project that was a flop. But that anyone ever said it was a flop. There's always like, oh yeah, I know sales didn't go up, but the awareness went through there. Or there's always a metric that marketers like to pull out and say, oh, New Coke, yeah, we did that on purpose, so you like the old one even better. I don't know.
Well, I'm that's not the official narrative. The official narrative is it was a mistake and they pulled back from it. But in the end, it ended up working out for them because they consolidated a bunch of market share. A deprivation strategy was the word I was trying to come up with. When you deprive somebody of a much, and the way Burger King did it was they took over a Burger King restaurant in Nevada where you can film people and then get their permission after, and they set it up with all these hidden cameras, and like they gave somebody like a Big Mac in their bag instead of a Whopper, and they're like, what is this? Like, I didn't order this. Or they said, sorry, we don't have any Whoppers. We don't carry them anymore. And like people were like, they come to the counter, they'd scream, they'd yell, and they filmed all this stuff, and it made it into the commercials.
I remember that. Deprivation strategy is what they used for the Got Milk campaign, because they realized that nobody actually goes out and drinks milk by itself. It's always milk or actually it was something and milk.
Yeah.
And that was the huge insight.
It's a supporting player, not the main character.
Right. So Sean, one of the things we ask our guests is, what are if you want to prognosticate and look into the future, what is your sense for the specifics of what you do, international brand building? Is it something you're optimistic about? Do you find it's hard to find talent creative talent to do the work that you're trying to do for your brands? What is your sense?
Yeah, I'm totally optimistic. Yeah, I mean, as we see, I think one argument is, hey, with the internet, everyone's international now, and that's not. I own a baseball and a baseball bat. Doesn't mean I'm a baseball player. I mean, yes, everyone can access you, but if you look at marketing as just build it and they will come, then you fundamentally, I think, have a problem to start with. But I think more people are realizing the potential of crossing borders with their brands and building global brand equity in a meaningful way, not just letting people come to your website, but actually going into those markets. I mean, the best brands, if you look at foreign brands that are here, LG, they don't particularly seem foreign to me. They feel pretty much right at home here in the States, for me anyhow. I think that's part of the trick, is that you don't go into the market. Sometimes you do, but often you don't go into the market like looking to be foreign. You want to assimilate, and to do that's hard work. And it really takes understanding the market and communicating to people in the way they like to be communicated to. So
yeah.
So I would say future's bright.
We're glad to hear that. Well, Sean, it's been great having you on the Brief Brothers. We really appreciate your time and your insights, and we will encourage all of our viewers to get your book and to read it. And good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time.